Earlier this week, Senator Chris Van Hollen, one of my United States senators from here in the state of Maryland, flew to the nation of El Salvador and was eventually able to meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man who was wrongfully deported from where he was living here in Maryland to a Salvadoran prison for no reason whatsoever. He has not even been accused of a crime, much less convicted of one. It was a great relief to many of us who have been following this story that Senator Van Hollen was able to eventually meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, because when Van Hollen first arrived in El Salvador, it looked like that might not happen. Here's an article on the subject from Raw Story by Brad Reed. Headline: The Trump administration is lying. Dem senator left furious by trip to El Salvador. Quoting from the article, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat Maryland, accused the Trump administration of blatantly lying about the whereabouts of wrongfully deported immigrant Kilmar Abrego Garcia on Wednesday. After touching down in El Salvador to inquire about Garcia's whereabouts, Van Hollen said that he was not able to see Garcia nor even to have a phone call with him. Per CBS News' Scott MacFarlane, Van Hollen explicitly said that the Trump administration is lying about Garcia. If you listen to President Trump, you would think that U.S. courts have found that Mr. Abrego Garcia is part of MS-13, Van Hollen said, referring to the violent criminal gang whose origins are in Central America. But in fact, they have not found that. Recently, a U.S. federal judge said that the Trump administration did not have evidence to support the claim that he had ever been a part of MS-13. He also emphasized that Garcia has never been charged with a crime. Again, since this article was published, happily, and I say happily in a very relative sense because there's not much happy about this terrible story, but relatively speaking, happily, Senator Van Hollen was able to locate and meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And here's an article about that meeting from the BBC by Crystal Hayes. Headline: U.S. Senator meets man mistakenly deported to El Salvador. Quoting from the article, a U.S. Senator has met a man who Trump administration officials have acknowledged was deported in error from Maryland to a mega prison in El Salvador. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen posted photos with Kilmar Abrego Garcia as the administration continues to resist his return to the U.S. despite yet another court ruling against the government on Thursday. Skipping down a little bit in the article to a section that gives us some more detail about that court ruling. A federal court on Thursday ruled against the Trump administration in a case that could force officials to testify under oath about the deportation. In a scathing judgment, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals called the administration's handling of the situation, quote, shocking. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order, wrote conservative Judge Harvey Wilkinson III, one of three judges on the panel. The government claims in essence that because it has rid itself of custody, that there is nothing that can be done, Judge Wilkinson wrote. This should be shocking not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. Why, the judge wrote, should the government not make what was wrong right? Skipping down a little bit further in the article for some more detail about Senator Van Hollen's meeting with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Quote, I said my main goal of this trip was to meet with Kilmar. Tonight I had that chance, the Democratic senator posted on social media. I have called his wife, Jennifer, to pass along his message of love. I look forward to providing a full update upon my return. Before the meeting, the senator said he was stopped by armed guards on his way to Secot, the maximum security prison where Mr. Abrego Garcia has been detained. Van Hollen arrived in the country on Wednesday, hoping to secure the release of Mr. Abrego Garcia, who had been living in Maryland. Skipping down a little bit further, during his trip, Van Hollen said he also met the country's vice president and asked that they open the doors so Mr. Abrego Garcia could leave the prison, a request, he says, was rejected. So, as I said, happy news in a very, very relative sense, happy within the broader context of this very unhappy, very embarrassing, very horrifying and infuriating story. Senator Van Hollen was at least able to meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia and verify that he's alive and he's relatively okay, and pass that along to his family, and hopefully continue down the road where maybe eventually he will be released from that prison. Ever since this story first was reported, it has reminded me of something. It has made me think about the fact that incidents like this, and like the broader Trump administration policy that this is just an example of, these are really just the latest stop on what has been a very, very long road in American history of the government choosing to disregard the rights of certain people for the convenience of the government, or specifically for the convenience of the people in power in the government at that given moment. The first thing it made me think of was during the most active years of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, which were all sort of collectively referred to as the War on Terror. Remember rendition? Or as it was sometimes referred to with more specificity, extraordinary rendition. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, or maybe you're too young to remember, or you've just forgotten, and boy, wouldn't we all like to forget, extraordinary rendition was what it was called when agents of the United States government, the CIA or someone else, would capture terrorists or suspected terrorists abroad in another country, and then instead of bringing those terrorists back to the United States to face interrogation and justice, or even to some American facility located overseas, they would take these terrorists to a third country, a country where the laws governing treatment of prisoners, or what was defined as torture, were a little more loose, were a little more lax, so that that prisoner could then be interrogated, and the interrogators wouldn't have to be so careful with treating the prisoner right, with respecting the rights of the prisoner. It was an incredibly unethical and illegal practice. It goes against everything that we Americans say we believe in. And I say we believe in because a lot of us very clearly don't actually believe in those things. But it was a dirty trick and a way to get around having to recognize and respect the human rights of people, and the right to due process specifically of people that, again, we say we respect, but we really don't. And we're very eager and very clever about finding ways around it. So this whole process of rounding up undocumented immigrants, or again, suspected undocumented immigrants, and not subjecting them to due process, not giving them access to due process, but immediately deporting them, and not just deporting them to another country and releasing them, but deporting them to a prison in another country that has been essentially contracted to house our prisoners, again, who have not been convicted of anything, have not been subjected to any kind of due process whatsoever. It smacks of, except for how public it is and how proud the Trump administration seems to be of it, it really smacks of rendition. And most people, most reasonable and reasonably humane people nowadays consider rendition to be an embarrassment, to be something that we definitely should not have done. But it's not the only time. That is one of the more recent times that, again, just jumped immediately to my mind. And not just rendition, by the way, the entire way that we tended to treat terror suspects that were apprehended during the War on Terror. Some of them were brought to this country and put on trial. Some of them were. Some of them were convicted and sentenced to serve prison terms in this country. Some of them were. A great number of them were arrested and detained indefinitely, were never brought to trial, were never given right to due process. Some of them are still being held in a prison in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which is a place that Trump tried to send migrants, undocumented migrants that had been captured. And that turned out to not be as feasible as the administration thought. That's why the administration is sending people to El Salvador. The Salvadoran prison plan is actually Plan B, because it turns out Guantanamo wasn't as suitable of a site. And boy, that must have really hurt, because, Trump would have loved the publicity of that. Trump would have loved to be able to say, like, Obama and Biden tried to shut down Gitmo, but I'm not only keeping it open, I'm expanding it, and we're going to put all of our undesirables, all of our criminals who came across the border, we're going to send them to Guantanamo where they belong. A bunch of them are probably terrorists anyway, right? They're all violent criminals or members of South American street gangs, etc., etc. But the fact that we still have suspected, accused 9/11 terrorists being held in American custody with just open-ended detention. They might get released tomorrow. They might never get released. And they have never been given access to the same justice system that you and I, as Americans, would be subjected to if we were accused of a crime. They're just locked up somewhere. And some of you might say, well, but Steve, you're forgetting something. These people are not American citizens. You're talking about members of Al-Qaeda or suspected members of Al-Qaeda. You're talking about people from other countries. You're talking about these undocumented migrants who came here illegally, who crossed the border without authorization. They're not United States citizens. Why should they be entitled to the same rights as the rest of us? Donald Trump himself, the President of the United States, I remind you, has recently said, in fact, he said it to the President of El Salvador when the President of El Salvador was here for a visit in this country just recently. He said that he would really like to start deporting American citizens to that same Salvadoran prison that is currently the location where undocumented migrants or suspected undocumented migrants who are apprehended are being sent. He wants to send citizens there too. He even said, what? So citizens are some special group? So all of you who are defending sending Kilmar Abrego Garcia there and are defending it by saying, well, he's not a citizen. Why should he have the rights of a citizen? You're saying, basically, in making that argument, that you think U.S. citizens are a special group because we are entitled to constitutional protections and rights and access to due process that, according to you, undocumented migrants who have been living here for many years peacefully and not causing any trouble are not entitled to. The President of the United States, who most of you who would make this argument probably voted for or would have voted for, he disagrees with you. He doesn't think that United States citizens are a special group. He doesn't think that United States citizens, or at least certain United States citizens that he has decided, in his royal wisdom, are nothing but trouble, are a threat. They don't have the same constitutional protections. They don't deserve the same constitutional protections that you and I have. It's completely fine in his mind for him to deport them, even though they are United States citizens, to that prison in El Salvador, the same one that he's sending all those undocumented migrants to, that a lot of you apparently have no problem with. He wants to do it to citizens too. And as I said, to me, this is just the latest stop on a very long road. If you go back before the War on Terror, wind it back a few more years, a few more decades even, let's not forget Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, where black people were explicitly treated differently under the law than white people. They were regarded as less deserving of the same liberties and constitutional protections as white people. Go back a little bit further, the World War II era, people in this country, including American citizens who were of Japanese heritage, were rounded up and put in concentration camps, as were some Italian Americans and some German Americans as well, but a much larger number of Japanese Americans. Their constitutional rights disregarded, held indefinitely in concentration camps because the mere fact of their heritage was deemed too much of a risk. They were too dangerous. They were a threat to the United States, just like, according to the Trump administration, people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia are. And, of course, if we go back even further than that, the original sin of this nation, the fact that the United States was founded as a slave state, constitutionally was a slave state, because back then our glorious founding fathers, or at least enough of them, decided that black people who had been brought here against their will, or were descendants of people who had been brought here against their will, who were slaves, who had no legal standing, were in their proper place in society because of the color of their skin, because of who they were. They didn't deserve the same constitutional rights. They weren't even legally regarded as citizens. They were property. They had no inalienable right to vote, to own property, to be free. They were treated differently because of who they were, because of what they looked like, because of the way the dominant class perceived them. And there is an unbroken line in American history from that to this. It's like a cancer that the United States has had since it was born. And this is a cancer that has grown and mutated and metastasized over the decades. There have been times when it has gone into remission. It's a kind of cancer that can be controlled with the proper treatment. If we keep an eye on it, if we monitor it very closely, and we keep taking the right medication, we can hold it at bay, sometimes for a very long time. But it's always there. And you know, something about us, something about the United States and our national character, and maybe it's just human nature. I don't know. But we can only go so long before we just forget to take our medication. Or maybe we talk ourselves into thinking that we shouldn't be taking our medication, that we should just stop taking it. And that cancer comes roaring back. And every time it comes roaring back, it's in a slightly different form. And maybe it's attacking slightly different parts of the American people, but it's always there. And we're seeing it now. And I want to make this as clear as I can possibly make it. Even if everything that the Trump administration has said about Kilmar Abrego Garcia is true, even if he really is a member of MS-13, even if he really is a violent, dangerous criminal, and I want to emphasize there is no evidence that any of that is true. Certainly no evidence for any of that anyone associated with the Trump administration who is responsible for this has taken into a court of law. There's no reason to believe any of those things is true about him. But even if all of it is true, he is still entitled to due process. Even if he is every bit the violent thug that they say he is still entitled to due process. Just like every one of those people being held as terrorists in Guantanamo Bay is entitled to due process, and it has been denied to them. It doesn't mean they're good people. It doesn't mean that they're angels that have been mistreated. It means they're human beings who have been subject to the authority of this nation. And as such, they are entitled to due process. They are entitled to having certain basic rights recognized and respected. Because let's not forget, due process is not just about helping to ensure fair treatment for the people who are accused of crimes. Due process exists. The right to due process exists Because when a person is arrested by the government and charged with a crime, they deserve to not be punished for that crime, to not be held responsible for that crime until it can be conclusively or at least persuasively demonstrated, at least demonstrated to a point where it's more likely than not that they actually did the thing they are accused of. Due process is not just about being nice to criminals. It's often simplified as that by people like Donald Trump and his supporters, and they're hard on for, we have to avoid being soft on crime. We can't be soft on crime. It's not about being soft on crime. It's about making sure that people you send to prison for crimes actually did the crimes. And if the government really has evidence, good, strong evidence, that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, or any of the other people that have been disappeared without due process, really are guilty of the things that they have been informally charged with by the government. They haven't been charged with these things in court in very many cases, but in the court of public opinion, in the context of press conferences and responding to questions from journalists and so forth, they've been accused of being violent, of being gang members, of being threats to the community, etc. If that is true, and the government has evidence of that, then they have nothing to fear from due process. You can be the most evil, vicious, dangerous motherfucker who was ever born. You could be a serial killer. And serial killers, by the way, who are caught and brought to justice, are routinely afforded due process. Because they deserve it. Not for being good people, but for being a person subjected to the laws of this country. And because, in theory, we only want to punish people who actually did the thing that we are accusing them of doing. It took us a long time to get here. And there were many stops along the way, and we have seen many different versions of this throughout American history. And the worst part is, well, actually, I think there's probably two things about this that are tied for the worst thing about this. The first of those is this was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that it would take this particular form, but it was inevitable, given the cycle of history in this country, that we would come to rest at a place like this again, where once again the government, the people in charge of the government at this time, would begin to deny and block the rights of the people to certain groups of people, would begin to treat due process as a weakness, and that denying due process to certain people was necessary to protect us all from these dangerous people. It was inevitable that we would get to some form of this at some point. And the second thing is, this is almost certainly not the last stop on this road.